Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books. From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read. Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown? This is Season 1, Episode 21, Picatrix, the Forbidden Manual of Celestial Magic. Let's dive in.
Yeah, so today we're really going deep into a text that has had a huge influence, really. Picatrix, it's called, but it's also known by its original Arabic title, Ghayat al-Hakim, which kind of translates to the goal of the wise.
The Goal of the Wise. That's a pretty loaded title, right? I mean, it makes you wonder, what kind of wisdom are we talking about here?
Oh, absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're not tackling the entire work, which is quite extensive. We're focusing on a selection of excerpts. It's like we're getting a curated tour of the most interesting and maybe the most dangerous parts of this book.
A guided tour, I like that. So what kind of excerpts do we have? What can our listeners expect on this journey?
Well, we have passages from the first two books, primarily. Those seem to be considered foundational. And then we have some intriguing snippets from the third and fourth books as well. And crucially, we have the translator's preface and introduction. Those are going to be really helpful in understanding, well, everything else.
Okay, so a taste of each part with some expert guidance to help us digest it all. That sounds like a good plan. And what are some of the key themes or topics that these excerpts cover?
We're going to encounter a lot. I mean, there's the pursuit of wisdom, of course, that's a big one. Then there's the creation of talismans, the power of astrological images, how planets exert influence, and even magical practices from different cultures. It's a real mix.
A real mix, a melting pot of ancient esoteric ideas. So our mission on this deep dive is to really unpack these core concepts, right? To try to understand what the author intended to convey.
That's right. And to hopefully uncover some of the surprising and maybe even a little bit disturbing elements of this text, this historical guide to what they called celestial magic. So are you ready to delve into the world of Picatrix?
I am. Let's start with the translator's perspective, because translating a medieval Arabic text, especially one that deals with such, let's say, specialized subjects, it can't be easy. I mean, where do you even begin?
You're absolutely right. The translator actually highlights the inherent challenges of working with medieval Arabic. For one, the language itself wasn't static. It evolved significantly over time, so even within the same period, the meaning of words could vary depending on the context.
So it's like how we use certain words today could be different from how they were used even a few decades ago.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, Ghayat al-Hakim, as it was originally known, blends multiple disciplines. We're not just talking about astrology here. It also incorporates metaphysics, philosophy, theology, and of course science as it was understood back then.
Right, which was a very different scientific framework. More holistic, you could say, more intertwined with philosophical and spiritual ideas.
Precisely. And the translator is careful to point out that while the Arabic language continued to evolve, the scientific understanding presented in this book, well, it's primarily of historical interest now. We have to approach it within its own context, not through a modern lens.
Right, it's like looking at ancient theories of medicine. Fascinating, but not necessarily something you'd want to use today.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's turn to the introduction of the Picatrix itself. Now, the fact that this is the first English translation, it's a pretty significant event for those who study Hermetic literature.
It is, yeah, and for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, Hermetic literature generally refers to texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. He was this mythical figure who embodied a blend of, well, Hellenistic, Egyptian, and other esoteric philosophies. It's a whole world of ancient wisdom and magic, really.
Right, and the introduction actually mentions that the Warburg Institute, which is renowned for its scholarly editions, they had previously published Picatrix in Arabic, German, and Latin. So an English translation was really needed. It fills a significant gap.
It does. Now, Picatrix wasn't the work of just one author, was it? It was more like a compilation, gathering knowledge from many different sources.
Right. It claims to have drawn information from something like 224 books by, and I quote here, ancient sages. Can you imagine the amount of research that went into this?
224 books. That's mind-boggling. It's like the ultimate research project.
It is. The author's goal was to synthesize all this diverse knowledge into a unified and, importantly, a practical system. A system of magic.
A practical system of magic. Now, the book is attributed to someone called Pseudo al-Matriti. That pseudo prefix is always intriguing. What's the story there?
Well, the introduction notes that the precise identity of the author is still a bit of a mystery. In this context, pseudo often suggests that the work was written in the style of, or attributed to, a famous figure to lend it authority, but not necessarily actually written by that person.
So there's a bit of a cloak and dagger aspect to it, even in its authorship. Now, the introduction also mentions a connection to the Rasail of the Ikhwan al-Safa, Can you tell us a bit about them and what the link is?
Sure, the Ikhwan Safa, also known as the Brethren of Purity, were this fascinating secret society. They were active in the 10th and 11th centuries, mainly in what is now Iraq. And they produced this massive encyclopedic work called the Rasia. It covered philosophy, science, all sorts of things. Really influential in Hermetic thought.
Okay, so they were like the intellectuals of their time.
They were, and there are some pretty strong stylistic similarities between the Rasail and Picatrix. Even some direct passages seem to have been borrowed. It suggests a shared worldview, maybe even direct influence.
So Picatrix wasn't just drawing from one tradition, but from many different intellectual currents, a real melting pot.
Exactly. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab thought all seem to have found their way in. There's even a possible connection to Jabir ibn Hayyan, the famous alchemist, although that one's more speculative.
Fascinating. So this book could be a key link between Western and Middle Eastern esoteric traditions, a bridge across cultures and time.
That's what the introduction argues. It also mentions that there's actually very little information available in English about the Ikhwan al-Safa, which is a shame because they're so crucial to understanding Picatrix.
Yeah, it sounds like they deserve more attention. Now, speaking of attention, Picatrix itself got a lot of that throughout history. It mentions that some pretty influential figures took notice.
It did. King Alfonso X of Castile, who is known as Alfonso the Wise, he actually commissioned a translation of Picatrix into Spanish in the 13th century that really helped spread its influence to the West.
Wow, so a king was interested in its secrets. What about during the Renaissance? Did it have any impact then?
Absolutely. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico da Mandola, they were aware of Picatrix and likely influenced by it. And then there's that famous story about Casanova, the infamous lover.
Oh yeah, Casanova. Always getting into trouble. What does he have to do with Picatrix?
Well, his arrest was partly attributed to his association with this book. It suggests that Picatrix was considered pretty controversial in later centuries, potentially dangerous even.
I can see why. A book of magic. It definitely sparks the imagination. Now, it also mentions a possible link to Johann Valentin Andrea's Fama Fraternitatis. That's a big one.
It is. Fama Fraternitatis is considered a foundational text for Rosicrucianism. So if there's a connection, that means Picatrix might have had an influence on a major esoteric movement.
A hidden hand guiding history. Okay, so this was not just some dusty old book gathering dust in a library. It had a real impact. And it presented a whole system, didn't it? A system that combined Arabic astrology and alchemy. That sounds incredibly complex.
It is a very intricate system. Imagine astrological symbolism and alchemical principles all woven together to understand and interact with, well, what they believed were the hidden forces of the universe.
I'm starting to see why it was considered forbidden. Okay, we've talked about the historical context and the book's significance. Now let's delve into the mind of the author. Why did he write The Goal of the Wise? What was his motivation?
Well, according to the preface, he was inspired by the surge of interest in talismans and magic that followed his previous work, The Rank of the Wise. Apparently, people were really intrigued, but maybe lacked a deeper understanding.
So, he saw a need to go beyond the basics, to reveal the secrets that he felt earlier philosophers had kept hidden.
Exactly. He wanted to unveil the true nature of magical practices and their outcomes, and he even admits that he's being intentionally vague in some places to protect the knowledge, he says, from those who are not ready for it.
Protecting the knowledge. Sounds like he took this stuff very seriously.
He did, and he structured Picatrix in a similar way to The Rank of the Wise, dividing it with 4 distinct books.
4 books. Okay, what does the first book focus on? What are the foundations?
Well, the first book is all about laying the groundwork. It's divided into 7 chapters, which the author explicitly links to the 7 classical planets, the ones visible to the naked eye.
Okay, so there's already some symbolism at play here. 7 chapters, 7 planets.
Right, and it covers the virtue of wisdom, the astrological ratios that are key for creating talismans, the concept of planetary light, and what he calls those vague meanings that philosophers intentionally left out.
So setting the stage, explaining the core principles. What about the second book? Where does that take us?
The second book shifts to the world of astrological images and their functions. It delves into the secrets surrounding those functions and introduces the concept of borrowing magic. There's even a discussion of Plato's interest in these images.
Borrowing magic. That's a really interesting idea.
It is, yeah. It suggests that magic isn't something you create out of nothing, but something you tap into, something that already exists in the world. We should definitely explore that more. Now, what about the third and fourth books? What secrets do they hold?
Yes, let's hear about those.
Okay, well, the third book delves into the fortunes of the planets, and it gets into how these planets interact, particularly through heat and the use of incense, even food and drink, to achieve specific magical outcomes. The author notes that the world is pretty dynamic and interconnected, which makes these interactions very complex.
So we're getting into the practical applications here. How to use planetary influence to your advantage.
Right. And then the fourth book, it takes a bit of a turn. It focuses on magical practices attributed to the Kurds, Nabateans, and Abyssinians. Even what their author calls magical tricks or naranjat, he actually considers these to be the best type of magic, which is interesting.
Magical tricks as the best kind of magic. I wouldn't have expected that. But that's what makes this so fascinating, right? It challenges our assumptions.
It does. So we've got a really broad spectrum of magical traditions covered here, from theory to practice, high magic to, well, maybe something a bit more like stage magic.
Now let's go back to the first book and unpack some of these key concepts. Starting with, well, wisdom. The author seems to consider it pretty important.
He does. He even starts by saying that wisdom is a super virtuous quality and it's really, really desirable. It's the knowledge of, well, the deeper reasons why everything exists, both the obvious and the hidden reasons. And he traces all these reasons back to the one being, which in this context is Allah.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about understanding the fundamental nature of reality and its connection to the divine.
Exactly. And pursuing wisdom is a must, according to the author. It's a moral obligation and a virtue that illuminates both the mind and the soul. It guides you away from just focusing on the material world and toward a deeper understanding of cause and effect. And ultimately, it leads you toward worship of the Creator.
Worship of the Creator. That's interesting. So the very spiritual dimension to all of this.
There is. He even quotes a verse from the Quran about the creation of jinn and humankind, saying that their purpose is to serve Allah, and he interprets that as meaning we need to know him through wisdom.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, he also talks about 3 specific characteristics of wisdom itself. What are those?
He says wisdom force never really vanishes once you have it. It also has a chastening quality. It guides and refines you. And maybe most interestingly, he says that wisdom only reveals itself to those who are truly interested. It's not just handed out.
So you have to work for it. It's a continuous pursuit, not just a one-time achievement.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about talismans. The author has this really interesting observation about the word itself. He says that in Arabic, when you reverse the letters of talsim, you get maslat, which means domination or control.
That's a pretty powerful statement, right? It suggests that talismans are all about exerting influence, maybe even manipulating forces.
That's the implication. And he goes on to say that a talisman works through a process of coercion, using things like numerical ratios, astrological secrets, and powerful incenses to bring out its inherent spirit or energy.
Like you're harnessing something, bending it to your will.
Exactly. And he uses some interesting analogies to explain how these talismans are believed to work. He compares them to the transformative power of yeast and the processes of alchemy.
Those are good analogies, actually. Yeast, it takes something simple and changes it completely. And alchemy, well, that's all about transformation.
Right, it's taking a base metal and turning it into gold. So he's suggesting that talismans operate in a similar way through these subtle but powerful forces that bring about significant change.
Change that you direct, that you control. Now, he also talks about 2 main branches of magic, the theoretical and the practical. What's the difference between those?
Okay, so theoretical magic is all about understanding the celestial mechanics. The positions of the stars, their images in the sky, the light they cast, and all those complex astrological ratios. It's the knowledge behind the magic.
Okay, the intellectual foundation. And then practical magic is, well, putting that knowledge into action.
Precisely. It's about working with the 3 fundamental origins of things in the natural world and the emanations of planetary forces. He talks about using heat and incense, even manipulating food and drink to achieve specific effects.
So it's like theoretical magic gives you the recipe, and practical magic is you in the kitchen actually cooking up the spell.
That's a great way to put it. And he also makes this interesting point that magical tricks, the naranjat, those are actually the highest form of practical magic.
That's surprising. So not just spells and rituals, but illusions and tricks as well.
It seems so. And he emphasizes the power of speech, too. He quotes both the prophet and Plato on this, saying that words have a profound influence.
The power of words, that's something that runs through many different spiritual traditions, right?
It does. He calls it an integral aspect of scientific magic, suggesting that language itself can be a magical tool.
Words as spells. Makes sense, I guess. Now, he also mentioned something called gained magic, which is linked to the story of Abraham taming the 4 birds.
Yes, and that story is from the Quran. God tells Abraham to take 4 birds, get to know them, then release them on separate hills, and when Abraham calls, they miraculously return.
I've heard that story. It's often interpreted as a symbol of resurrection, right? But what does it have to do with magic?
Well, in this context, it seems to represent a type of magical power or knowledge that comes from a divine source. It's bestowed upon you, not something you learn on your own.
Like a gift from God. Interesting.
Now, he also talks about the ancient Greeks and their specific areas of magical expertise. He mentions Nyanjat, which are those magical tricks, and then syllogismus, which he equates to talismans, and also the ability to bring down high spirits.
Bring down high spirits sounds intense. Like summoning angels or something?
Could be. It suggests that they were believed to have this power to interact with spiritual beings or forces from higher realms. And he ends book one by emphasizing the importance of understanding the 7 classical planets, their characteristics, and their positions in the celestial band. He even quotes the statement, "I am the one who is elevated above the 7 heavens."
That sounds like it's hinting at the hierarchical structure of the cosmos. A chain of being with, higher and lower levels.
Exactly. And the Quranic verse about the prophet Idris being raised to a high station by God reinforces this idea of an elevated status, a closer connection to the divine.
It's all about understanding your place in the grand scheme of things, both on Earth and in the heavens. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in book one. Let's move on to book two, which focuses on celestial images and the secrets that philosophers supposedly kept hidden. It really emphasizes that idea of esoteric knowledge being guarded, passed down only to the initiated.
It does, and book two starts by stating that the intellectually inclined are always trying to decipher the symbolic language and those cryptic expressions used by philosophers, because those were the means by which they achieved their goals. The author then goes on to say that his own interest in this was sparked by Ptolemy.
Ptolemy, the famous astronomer, what did he have to say about all this?
Well, Ptolemy asserted that the images we see in the earthly realm are actually obedient to the images in the celestial realm. So what happens above influences what happens below.
As above, so below. That's a classic Hermetic principle, the idea that the cosmos is reflected in the microcosm of our world.
Precisely. And the author adds that philosophers widely believe that the planets themselves have these inherent forces or energies simply by their nature. And this leads into a discussion of how talisman makers would create their objects, drawing planetary figures at specific times, using stones and incenses that resonate with the energies they want to invoke.
It's like they're creating a physical representation of those celestial influences, imbuing it with power.
Right, and he also emphasizes the need for what he calls mathematical survey and the art of matching to really understand astrology.
Okay, what does that mean exactly? Mathematical survey and art of matching? Sounds pretty technical.
Well, mathematical survey refers to understanding the geometry of the celestial bodies, how they move and relate to each other. It's the math behind the astrology. And the art of matching is being able to see the connections between those celestial bodies and earthly phenomena. Which planet corresponds to which element, which human characteristic, and so on.
So it's about understanding the language of the cosmos, both the math and the symbolism.
Exactly. And he keeps coming back to the idea that it's difficult to talk about these celestial images because philosophers intentionally obscured this knowledge. He even mentions Zosimos's book of the Great Images as an example of this tradition of secrecy.
It was like they were protecting something precious, something potentially dangerous in the wrong hands.
Right. Then he gets into how the Indians visualized constellations, which was quite different from the Greek or Arabic traditions. He describes them as constructing these elaborate mental images. For example, they might picture a specific type of man in the first phase of Aries.
That's interesting. So they weren't just looking at the stars, they were creating these whole stories and images in their minds.
They were, but the author then says that these are delusive imaginings about the actual nature of the stars, even though the Indians linked these figures to specific planetary houses and their qualities.
So he's not entirely buying into the Indian system, but he still finds it worth discussing.
He does. He sees it as symbolic, maybe a way to remember the astrological principles, and then he talks about the names, shapes, and positions of constellations as symbolic of their actions.
Like if a constellation looks like a detached head, it might symbolize something related to, well, decapitation or loss of reason.
Right, and some talismans were actually created based on those symbolic interpretations.
So the form of the talisman reflects its intended function. It's like a visual spell.
It is, and then he has this really poetic line where he says that sleeping is information of the absent veiled by time, and death is information of distant transcendental things. It's like he's suggesting that these states of being aren't just passive, but they hold hidden knowledge.
That we can access if we know how. Now, he also mentions the first wise. Who was that?
He doesn't really explain, but he says that the first wise talked about a mind-blowing number of images, over 10,000, each associated with a degree of the celestial sphere and capable of producing miraculous effects.
10,000 magical images. That's a lot to process. So basically, every little point in the sky holds a specific power.
That's the idea. And to tap into that power, you need to know which image corresponds to which degree and what effect it has. It's incredibly intricate.
Sounds like it. And then he ends book 2 with some instructions on working with planetary positions to achieve specific magical effects. But, as usual, there's a warning attached. Don't share this knowledge with those who aren't ready for it.
Right. He's very cautious about who he shares this information with. He clearly believes it's powerful and potentially dangerous.
A double-edged sword. Okay, we've been deep in the theory here for a while. Let's get practical. What are some of the specific talismans and their effects that he mentions in the excerpts?
Okay, so there are quite a few. He mentions a talisman that can supposedly prevent marriage between two specific people. It involves burying something at a particular time aligned with the planets.
A love-stopping talisman. That's pretty intense.
It is. There's also one for releasing a captive using the moon's hour and the ascendant. So timing is crucial here. You have to do it at the right moment, astrologically speaking.
Like catching a wave at the right moment.
Exactly. Then there are some more general ones, like attracting good fortune from all directions, and some really specific ones, like repelling scorpions. He even mentions a remedy for scorpion bites using a bezoar stone carved under specific lunar and solar alignments.
That's fascinating. From love to scorpions, it seems like there's a talisman for just about anything.
It does. There's one for creating affection between people, one for promoting crop growth, and one for business success. All sorts of things.
So it's like a magical toolbox. You just pick the right tool for the job.
And some are very specific, like one for relieving kidney stone pain using a lion carved on a garnet during the hour of the sun, or one for silencing negative talk using a shield of light and a spiritual veil.
Wow, those are pretty specific. It really shows the range of what they believe talismans could do. Not just physical effects, but psychological and social ones, too.
Absolutely. And there's even one for exposing secrets using the power of these spiritual souls. It really emphasizes that these talismans were seen as tools for interacting with forces beyond the material world.
Like conduits to a hidden reality. Okay, what else does he say about how these talismans work? What makes them effective?
He says that your intention has to be very focused, and you have to speak the right words during the whole process. And the essence of the talisman itself has to mirror the intended action, whether it's good or evil.
So it's like programming a computer, but with spiritual energy.
Kind of, yeah. And the materials you choose are important too. Metals, animal parts, plants, specific incenses, all carefully selected to resonate with the desired outcome.
So you can't just grab any old rock and call it a talisman. There's a whole system behind it.
There is. And he talks about the ancient Greek philosophers who would observe the planets along with their dragon, which refers to the lunar nodes. And they would use incense and make sacrifices.
So it's not just about making the object. It's about aligning yourself with the cosmic forces.
Exactly. And he says something really interesting. He says that knowing the produced result of a well-made talisman is actually more significant than the result itself.
So it's not just about getting what you want. It's about understanding how you got it.
Precisely. Knowledge is power. And he goes into the idea of the human being as a microcosm reflecting the larger macrocosm, the human body as a mirror of the celestial sphere.
That's a core concept in Hermetic thought, right? As above, so below.
It is. He draws parallels between the shape of the head and the celestial vault, the number of bones and organs, and their astrological significance. He even says that the human spirit influences the body in the same way that planetary forces influence the world.
So we have this incredible power within us if we know how to tap into it. Now, he also makes this distinction between what he calls partial and full human existence. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's saying that the whole human is defined by reason and intellect, while the partial human is more perishable and susceptible to external influences. He also stresses the importance of virtue and purity for gaining true knowledge.
So it's not just about understanding the mechanics of magic. It's about being a good person. Your moral character matters.
It does. And then he references Plato's discussion of images in Timaeus, saying that Plato was intentionally vague on certain points, again suggesting that some knowledge is best kept hidden.
Protecting the secrets, that's a recurring theme.
It is. He outlines a whole hierarchy of being, starting with the high being, then descending through various levels all the way down to speaking animals. And he places the human mind at a crucial point, capable of descending into the material world and also ascending back to higher understanding.
So we're caught in the middle with the potential to go either way, higher or lower.
Exactly. And he says that the primordial, the very beginning, was when the elements agreed to accept an image. It's like that's how form and manifestation come into being, through the interplay of the elements and those celestial images.
It's a really beautiful concept, actually. The world is a canvas, constantly being painted by the stars.
It is, and he talks about borrowing magic from the magician of the ether. That's an evocative phrase.
The magician of the ether sounds like a powerful being. A cosmic magician, maybe.
It suggests that magical power comes from this fundamental source, a realm beyond the material world. And then he talks about the influence of the sun and the moon, how they affect temperature and cycles.
The two most obvious celestial bodies, they play a big role in most astrological systems.
They do, and he introduces those concepts of Sayud and Nuhus. Those are the planets traditionally associated with good fortune and misfortune, and their position relative to the ascendant is crucial.
So it's not just about which planets are present, but where they are in relation to you at a specific moment.
Right, and then he talks about planetary phases, the third, sixth, and converging phases. Those also influence outcomes in magical workings. It's all about understanding those specific angles and relationships between the celestial bodies.
It's like a cosmic dance, and you have to learn the steps. Now, he mentions Aristotle, saying that he advised people to align their actions with the movements of the celestial sphere and to choose auspicious stars. So it's not just about doing magic, it's about living in harmony with the cosmos.
Right, making choices that are aligned with the flow of celestial energy. And he mentions those ancient talisman makers who believed in inward and outward moving parts within the celestial sphere. So it's even more nuanced than just looking at planetary positions. There are these subtle forces at play.
It's a very complex system. And then we have that categorization attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, dividing miracles into talismans, working with the stars, and Ghayat. What's that last one?
It's not entirely clear, but it seems to be a type of magic that involves a more direct connection to spirits or subtle energies. It's linked to Indian, Yemeni, and Egyptian traditions.
So again, we see that diversity of magical approaches.
We do, and the section about Indian expertise is really fascinating. They were known for their knowledge of poisons, music, and some unusual practices. Impregnation without sex, an anti-aging drink. They even believed in a building behind the equator inhabited by jinn and guided by Mars and the South Node.
A building behind the equator inhabited by jinn. That's a new one for me. It really shows how different cultures had these unique cosmological ideas.
It does, and even Hermes is quoted as saying that some planetary images are actually illusory, influenced by Indian science. So even within these ancient traditions, there was a recognition that not everything was necessarily true.
A healthy dose of skepticism. I like that.
Now, he also talks about dreams, seeing them as objective representations influenced by imagination and mental strength. He suggests that they're connected to the celestial world and can provide real insight.
Dreams as a window to the cosmos.
Exactly. And he says that fortune-telling is derived from revelation, which acts as an imagining force of the mind.
So it's not about seeing a fixed future, but about tapping into a deeper knowing.
Right. And finally, he mentions the Indian belief in spirits who appear to magicians and influence events, and the idea that talismans can be even more powerful than our own choices, like miracles that use natural characteristics.
So magic can override free will. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but it shows the profound belief in the power of talismans to shape events, to harness those fundamental forces of the universe.
This has been an incredible deep dive, Isabel. We've covered so much ground, from the history of Picatrix to its core concepts of wisdom, magic, celestial influence, and even the specifics of how talismans were created and used. It's been mind-blowing.
It has. And for you, our listener, the learner, we hope this has been a valuable exploration. We've tried to present this complex information in a way that's engaging and accessible without overwhelming you.
We've given you the highlight, the key takeaways, and hopefully sparked your curiosity to learn even more. Now, for a final thought to ponder, Picatrix really emphasizes the power of intention, the influence of the stars, and the manipulation of natural correspondences. It makes you wonder how these ancient ideas might connect to contemporary discussions about things like manifestation, the popularity of astrology, or even the placebo effect.
Right, because ultimately it's all about the power of belief, isn't it? Whether we're talking about ancient magic or modern science, our beliefs shape our reality.
They do. So what does that forbidden knowledge really mean to it today? Is it truly forbidden, or is it just a different way of understanding the world and our place within it? That's something to consider as we continue our journey through the occult archives.